In the previous section, we were introduced to the basic concepts of directives, what they are, how simple ones are built, and how directives can be separated from each other via isolate scope. In this section, we come back to scope again, and in particular, we look at how ampersand can be used to bind functions. We'll explain something that sounds complicated, that's transclusion, and we'll show how it can be used to make a simple driver card. And then we'll look at how our directives can be restricted by type. In this video, we'll come back to the scope, using =* to watch an expression in a different way. We'll learn the difference between using true and an empty hash for our scope. And finally, for those users who use controllerAs right now as their syntax for dealing with a replacement for scope, a handy thing within AngularJS code, we'll show how controllerAs and bind_to_controller give you that same power on your directives. In your AngularJS development, you've likely used $watch before. You might also have used $watch collection or other flavors of it, each one of which is tuned to a particular kind of watch that you might need to do. Every watch performs much the same function. It's watching an expression for changes. $watch collection is designed to be more efficient when you have a large collection of items and you don't necessarily want to watch each individual item for changes inside of it. You might need to do the same sort of thing in your directive, and =* gives you that same kind of capability within your directive bindings. Equals, we've already learned, is our way of binding an outer expression to a scope variable. =* simply does that with a watch collection instead of a watch on the outer expression. So in theory, if you had really long lists to deal with, you might potentially see better performance from this use. Now let's cover a different kind of scope binding that wasn't covered previously. You learned about having no scope set up at all in your directive. That simply inherits the parent scope, the controller in this case. You also learned about setting up a scope using an object hash where you specify keys which are going to become variables and characters which are going to specify how they bind to expressions or strings in the outer scope. Those are great, but there is actually one other choice, and that is setting the scope to true. If you do this, what's going to happen is the directive is going to inherit the scope from the parent, but it will be its own scope, and it will simply inherit variables from the parent. The distinction there is just a little bit subtle. Here, what you see is as soon as I put this to true, parent variable now has a value. So you see it here. Previously, this was all hidden. But if I try to assign to it inside the directive, like so, what you see is that I assign to a local scope variable inside the directive without changing the outer scope variable that belongs to the controller. So this version of parent variable is unaffected. If you're already familiar with AngularJS's controllerAs syntax, you've seen this before. You've seen as test or as whatever to name a particular controller and then refer to variables and functions on the controller rather than simply assuming that they're on whatever scope is wrapping a particular directive, like you see here and here. Over in the controller, no scope is injected. Everything is simply attached directly to the controller itself. If you're already used to that, you're not going to want to suddenly have to deal with scope when you do your directives. So for those people who are using it, you must have a controller on your directives where you use controllerAs. Then you use controllerAs to specify what name the controller should have. Here you see me referring to a variable on that controller. And here's the nifty piece that they added later on, which was bind_to_controller, which allows you to specify a scope set of bindings, and these variables will automatically be created using the same rules that you've always specified for scope previously, only they will go directly onto the controller itself. So I can refer to u.list and know that list will be created via this binding setup right here. That's what bind_to_controller does. So I don't have to set that stuff up myself. This makes it really easy to use controllerAs in directives just like you do everywhere else. Our next video is using ampersand to bind functions.